Hey people, it's Nias talking. I would like to thank Pro-Black Vote Free for telling me about this. So this is another Black Heroes video. This is Philip Payton, the Godfather of Harlem. Now I'm using the source New York Almanac. So here goes. Real estate, Philip Payton and the rise of Black Harlem. The Underground Railroad Coalition recently announced a major effort to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the New York State constitutional provision that ended slavery in the state on July 4, 1827. The emancipation provision in the New York State Constitution 1799 provided for the gradual elimination of slavery in New York, but it did not end the widespread legal race discrimination in the state. The most glaring example of this was the New York State Constitution of 1821, which eliminated property qualifications to vote for white men, but denied black men owning less than $250 of property the right to vote. This had the effect of disenfranchising the overwhelming majority of African American men and remained in effect until the enactment of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1870, despite the vigorous efforts of New York black leaders like Henry Highland Garnett. In the first decade of the 20th century, however, through a surprising turn of events, the situation would begin to change, especially with regard to housing. The man who would largely be responsible for this change was not a spiritual leader or orator like Frederick Douglass or Henry Highland Garnett, but a young real estate man named Philip Payton, who most people have never heard of. Payton created the Afro-American Realty Company and formed an alliance with certain Jewish landowners to create modern Black Harlem. Payton came to New York City in 1899 in his early 20s from Westfield, Massachusetts. To his parents' chagrin, he dropped out of college and began work as a real estate agent in a company dealing with black tenants, mostly in Hell's Kitchen. After taking a course in 1902, sponsored by an affiliate of Booker T. Washington's National Negro Business League, he quit his job with a real estate company to strike out on his own as a realtor for African Americans. Payton noted that in the northern part of Harlem, around 135th Street and Lenox Avenue, there were many vacant and near-vacant buildings whose rents were not much higher than the tenants in Hell's Kitchen. The problem was that African Americans were restricted from living there by racial discrimination. None of the real estate owners would rent to them. The Jewish community in the city of New York was facing a similar problem, in that they were restricted from living in many areas of the city, particularly in the Bronx and Queens. This problem worsened in 1879 when Joseph Seligman, a leading Jewish financier and businessman in the city along with his family, were denied admission to the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs because they were Jewish. Although Seligman bitterly protested his policy, the owners of the Grand Hotel insisted they had the right to exclude any minority they chose, and discrimination in housing and accommodations accelerated throughout the state. Ironically, one of the areas of the city where Jews were allowed to live was Harlem. Although Jews were excluded from Harlem at first, economic pressures were such and Jews were white, so the homes were sold wealthy Jewish owners. By 1890, Harlem was home to the second largest Jewish community in the city and the fourth largest in the country, many of whose residents were upper-class Jews seeking refuge from the crowding of the Lower East Side. There was some sympathy for the position of the black community, especially among Jews recently arrived from Russia, but many upper-class Jewish people in Harlem believed that allowing African Americans in their neighborhood would decrease their property values. Others worried that not going along with their white neighbors would encourage an already rising anti-Semitism and might jeopardize their own privileges. The Afro-American Realty Company. As Payton would later tell it, one day a landlord on 134th Street, presumably having difficulty filling their buildings, was fighting with another and threatened to rent his building to African Americans. This landlord offered Payton a lease on his building if he could fill it. Payton found black tenants who would sublease apartments in the building from him at rents that were comparable to those in Hell's Kitchen. Payton soon filled the building in what had seemed to Harlem landlords a difficult market, and others began contacting him. In a short time, Payton had several buildings under his management, and his real estate business was prospering. One day he was approached by a representative of the Hudson Realty Company, which offered to buy out his leases for an extremely high price. He was delighted for a time, but soon learned that Hudson Realty Company was the agent for the Owners Protective Association of Harlem, bent on evicting his new black residents. The Owners Protective Association of Harlem sought deed and lease covenants on buildings in Harlem, saying they could not be rented or sold to African Americans. One company that didn't go along was the real estate firm Castle and Goldberg, which agreed to sell Payton's buildings. Virtually nothing is known today about Castle and Goldberg. They may have believed that by the black community breaking racial covenants in Harlem, similar restrictions against Jews in other parts of the city would fall. They may have just done it for the money. Whatever their motives, the result was the Owners Protective Association of Harlem failed in its attempt to keep African Americans off the block and ultimately sold the buildings back to Payton at a loss. Payton also appealed for help to the city's black business community, dominated by members of the National Negro Business League and consisting of the city's leading black businessmen. Many of the members of the League were older men who had come to New York from the South and worried that confronting the white establishment by moving blacks into this one of the city's more elite suburbs risked a violent reaction, which might include physical attacks and lynchings. And for anyone who says maybe they were being cowardly or scared, this was a very real thing. Lynchings happen all the time for any reason. So it was very much a risk, and I can't blame them for being scared of that happening. Payton argued that conditions in New York City with its various ethnic groups were different. He argued that the time to take a stand to fight the discrimination that kept them in the slums of Hell Kitchen was now, and the place for their future was Harlem. The Jewish people that lived there, he argued, were more afraid of being lynched themselves than attacking black residents. He also pointed to those who were willing to support the efforts in recognition had it was in the interest to end the restrictions. Payton formed a new company, the Afro-American Realty Company, which was capitalized with more than $500,000, contributed by the leading black businessmen in the city. The corporation's directors issued a prospectus seeking contributions from African Americans. It stated that the company intended to practice race economics to attack racial barriers. African Americans who could respond to the call, and the company ultimately had a capitalization of more than $1 million, making it one of the largest black-owned enterprises in the country at the time. Backed by the full weight of the black business community, the Afro-American Realty Company, Payton was its chief executive, began buying buildings in Harlem, sometimes through white agents. A New York Times article of December 8, in 1904, entitled "Race War Breaks Out in Harlem Real Estate," and another on December 17, 1905, "Race War Started in Harlem," both described its operations and the consternation its activities brought to many white Harlem residents. And one thing I saw in the clip from Pro Black for Free is that after they had attempted to buy the buildings and evict black residents, Payton would also buy buildings and evict all the white residents and move black residents in. Yeah. So he made sure to didn't do this love thy neighbor nonsense, and he was willing to stand up for his people and put them first. It's estimated that within 3 years it's owned more than 25 buildings and had more than 1,500 tenants under management. The 1907 report of the National Negro Business League extensively covered the Afro-American Realty Company and noted that Payton was one of the most prominent black businessmen in the nation. In 1908, however, the Afro-American Realty Company ran into trouble. There was a recession in New York real estate, and the company became overextended financially and facing default on its obligations. It failed, and the many blacks who invested with such high hopes lost their money. White lenders repossessed its properties, and there were lawsuits accusing Payton of mismanagement and fraud. The rise of Black Harlem. The Afro-American Realty Company was not a complete failure, however. As a result of its efforts, the seemingly insurmountable walls of racial discrimination housing had been breached and there was no turning back. Payton's efforts to settle African Americans in Harlem were continued by other black realtors such as John E. Nail and Henry G. Park, former directors of the African American Realty Company and affiliated with wealthier black churches such as St. Philip's Episcopal Church and Abyssinian Baptist Church. In 1911, a row of previously all-white residents on 135th Street was purchased for a very high price by one of these churches, the so-called $1 million houses. With this purchase, the Harlem Protective Owners Association collapsed. The area north of 125th Street quickly became a predominantly black community. Payton subsequently continued in business operating under the name Philip A. Payton Co., and in 1917 closed on a $1.5 million deal for 6 apartment houses. The buildings were renamed after black heroes: Crispus Attucks, Toussaint Louverture, Phyllis Wheatley, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Frederick Douglass, and Booker T. Washington. Payton died several weeks later of cancer at the age of 41. By then, the black population of Harlem exceeded 50,000. During the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, the neighborhood became the unquestioned intellectual and political capital of black America. Philip Payton, however, would be largely forgotten. There remains no monument, plaque, or other recognition of him in Harlem or elsewhere. There's also no plaque marking the $1 million house on 135th Street, the purchase of which was so critical in the defeat of the efforts of the Owners Protective Association of Harlem. Well, this is very interesting, and I want to say this. This also proves this whole marching, we shall overcome thing was a fallacy. Jesse Owens once said of Tommy Carlos and the two men who stood up at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics with their fists raised in the air, and he said, that black power fist doesn't mean anything unless you open it and there's a dollar. And this is proof of it. All the speeches in the world, it could not have changed it. When they bought those homes and they said, we're going to rent it out to our people, and the money we get from them will go to us to protect our people, it did a world of good. And in doing so, Philip Payton paved the way for the Harlem that we know, that is us, even to this day with the huge gentrification that's going, a hub of the black community. So anyway, please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. I'm going to leave this article and as many others as I can find related to Philip Payton, there's a New York Times one, in the description so people can read as much as they can about Philip Payton. And we really need to honor these courageous business leaders who really risk their lives and their finances to help promote black people to, what's the word, the middle classes, and give them economic opportunities that white America would never do. Peace.